On this Saturday night, Lee leaves thousands in the dark. The post-tropical cyclone swirls to the Maritimes.
It's wild weather down here.
It's Plan of Action. We're live on the ground. The nightmare to coordinate help in Libya. Our interview with a Libyan champion of women's rights on the sad reality for women and children there right now. Pile up at the plant.
And that's what we're looking for, our fair share.
What an ongoing auto strike in the U.S. could mean for your wallet as concerns over labor talks grow here at home. And woman, life, freedom. Marking the one-year anniversary of a global movement that still rages on.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Whipping waves and fierce winds as post-tropical cyclone Lee makes landfall in the Maritimes, battering and soaking Nova Scotia and New Brunswick with heavy rains and high winds. Some areas are recording gusts of up to 110 kilometers per hour. Good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Now, even if it isn't that monster Category 1 hurricane it was just days ago, officials are warning not to underestimate Lee. The post-tropical cyclone has left tens of thousands of people without electricity between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Callum Smith starts off our coverage tonight.
The always popular Peggy's Cove continued bringing people out in droves today, catching a glimpse of the stormy seas and wild waves near the iconic lighthouse, and a lone security guard left trying to keep people back. In nearby Prospect, Nova Scotia, the breakwater doing its best to fend off the waves, with homes and people nearby.
Wild weather down here. The surge is up and everything is tip-top high.
Some 200,000 customers were off the grid in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick this afternoon, leaving crews tasked with repairs trying to get people back on. More than 60,000 were bumped off it in Halifax alone. In these homeowners' front yard,
we thought that would be the worst thing, that we lost power. Turns out no.
A tree toppled over around lunchtime. No clear damage, but they're worried about the weight on their home. Other than a few downed trees, it seemed fairly quiet in Halifax, aside from those waves.
This is par for the course. Yeah, we get everything here. We're as far out as you can get.
People in Shediac, New Brunswick, perhaps enjoyed that surf a little too much Saturday morning.
We're going to stay close to shore, and really, we're all experienced riders, so beginners are definitely not encouraged to come on a day like today.
In Moncton, a maritime storm didn't even stop this wedding from taking place.
Good luck. Thank you.
Officials have said Lee wouldn't be as bad as when post-tropical storm Fiona hit last year, but for many, it still packed a significant punch.
This is the first one, I don't know, in my whole life that I've seen a storm like this.
This looks much worse than Fiona. We didn't get the storm surge like that.
While the region may have avoided the worst, damage has been done, and it will take some time until the full extent of that can be assessed. Callum Smith, Global News, Halifax.
And there's still plenty to remain cautious about as the storm moves through the region. Global's chief meteorologist Anthony Farnell is in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, experiencing some of the harsh weather firsthand. Anthony, what's it been like over there today? What have you seen?
Well, I've seen just about everything that you would expect in a hurricane, now post-tropical cyclone Lee. We woke up and it was pouring rain. They've had about 75 millimeters of water here in Yarmouth, and that is on top of what's been a very wet summer. Although flooding was not the primary concern today. It really was the surf, the waves crashing ashore, the fact that the storm surge, if it arrived right at high tide, would have been very bad and likely inundated a lot of the boardwalks and a lot of the roads around some of the coves. But the wind, the widespread nature of it, and the fact that pockets of damage occurred in just about every community of Nova Scotia and into New Brunswick, that really is what's going to have the lasting memory. The fact that these trees came down on power lines and affected just people's way of life, and it's going to take some time obviously for the power to come back on. But as we were going around just the region around Yarmouth, just seeing the surf is just an incredible sight, and the fact that the wind has completely done the full spectrum, 360 degrees from when we got up this morning and till now, as the eye, or what was left of it, the center of Lee, passed just off Yarmouth's shore and actually made landfall not too long ago in Long Island, Nova Scotia. And now it's moving across the Bay of Fundy. Farah?
Yeah, so Anthony, I mean, it is moving its way through Atlantic Canada. So what kind of conditions can we expect into Sunday? Is it still a threat?
Yeah, it's still a threat throughout the night tonight. And one thing, it is starting to get dark here in Nova Scotia, and there are power lines down all over the place. There are trees down as well. So obviously you're not supposed to go out at night. You just got to wait till tomorrow and you'll be able to start the cleanup. But the storm is moving now a bit quicker. Let's take a look at the big picture. The fact that these tropical storm force winds extend over 600 kilometers across, all that heavy rain still falling in New Brunswick, but the track brings it across that province into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and then over Newfoundland and Labrador, but it will be weakening quickly over these colder waters. And now that it's post-tropical, it means that it's going to even more so weaken and then move back out into the Atlantic. So tomorrow is a much better day with lighter winds. Tonight, however, still more damage could occur. Farah?
Okay, that's good to know. Thanks so much, Global News meteorologist Anthony Farnell in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Residents of Hay River, Northwest Territories are finally able to go back home after being displaced by wildfires for more than a month. Today, the evacuation order for the town was downgraded to an evacuation alert. Residents, though, are being warned that health services will be limited and schools won't open right away. In Calgary, 6 more daycares have closed, linked to that massive E. coli outbreak there. Alberta's chief medical officer says children from the sites have tested positive, some linked to daycares from the original outbreak. So far, there have been 337 lab-confirmed cases. 12 children are in hospital. 6 of them are on dialysis. In northeast Libya, search and rescue efforts for those who went missing from the devastating floods in Derna are now into a 6th day, with more bodies being pulled from the sea. According to the Red Crescent, more than 11,000 people have been killed so far, with an estimated 10,000 people still missing. Entire districts of the coastal city were swept away or buried in brown mud after 2 dams broke, sending a wall of water gushing through the streets. The United Nations says more than 1,000 people have been buried in mass graves, prompting warnings from aid groups about the risk of contaminating water. Joining us now is Libyan-Canadian Dr. Alaa Murabit, founder of the Voice of Libyan Women and a global expert in health, sustainability, development, and women's rights. Dr. Murabit, thanks so much for joining us. I know this is a very difficult time for your community.
Thanks so much for having me, but I really appreciate all the work that you and Global are doing to amplify what's happened in Libya.
I know you've been in touch just recently with what's going on the ground, with people on the ground there. What are you hearing?
I'm hearing that I think one of the realities of this flood was that it happened in a country that was already riddled with, conflict and poor governance. And so I'm hearing what's expected after 5 days, that rebuilding is unlikely to happen soon, that this will heavily impact, children and families and for years and decades to come. And I think what I'm hearing more than anything is just how much this highlights the vulnerability of this region to climate change, and especially when you marry that to human negligence, to government corruption, decades of dictatorship and conflict, and really the erosion of governance. There's a lot of confusion on the ground. I don't think anybody expected a catastrophe of this scale. So despite the fact that we have a lot of international organizations coming in, we have a lot of national goodwill and people coming into the region to help as much as they can. It's incredibly disorganized. People are incredibly confused about where to go for basic resources, where to go for shelter, for food. So just a lot of confusion, heartbreak, and I think anger. I think a lot of anger.
Well, I'll bet there's anger there and there's frustration, and that's not even talking about the mental toll that people have gone through. Now, you've been a champion of women's rights in Libya, but, I've noticed there's very few images of women there, and we're hearing very few female voices from Derna. So what are you hearing about what the women are going through, their plight there right now?
I think for a lot of the women, the women are as surprised by, as taken aback by the catastrophe. A lot of them are continuing to look for family. A lot of them are continuing to look for shelter and food and loved ones. I think one thing that makes crisis much more difficult is separation from family during an emergency makes, women and girls especially vulnerable to abuse because of their gender, their age, and their reliance on others for assistance, for safe passage, for resources. And so there's definitely a heightened vulnerability there that we all have to be conscious of that happens in all crises, not just in Libya. And that's something that I know many international organizations are keeping in mind, but one that we all should.
Dr. Alaa Murabit, thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thank you so much for having me, Farah.
Auto workers in the U.S. walk off the job. Coming up, how unprecedented strike action could impact Canada. Unprecedented labor action in the U.S. Auto workers targeting the big three American auto companies have hit the picket lines all at the same time. As Richard Zussman tells us, Canadians could be impacted next.
It's a labor traffic jam the likes the auto sector has never seen. Simultaneous strikes happening at General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler's parent company Stellantis for the first time ever.
This strategy will keep the companies guessing. It will give our national negotiators maximum leverage and flexibility in bargaining.
For now, 3 assembly plants in the United States are behind picket lines, with the United Auto Workers and the automakers back at the negotiating table. The union demanding a bigger share of record profits, shorter work weeks, and stronger job security in the wake of shifts to electric vehicles.
We've gone years without a raise. We want our fair share.
And this may just be the start of the pileup. Here in Canada, auto union Unifor and Ford are negotiating. The union so far rejecting 2 offers from the company, with a midnight Eastern strike deadline approaching on Monday.
We are also experiencing a once-in-a-century transition of the sector. In this context, auto workers across Canada are seeking a fair contract, and we've started with Ford Motor Company.
The impact of ongoing American job action has been minimal in Canada so far, but any extended strike will put a dent in an industry that currently sees more than $35 billion of goods shipped over the border every year.
Canada is going to escape without too much damage unless the United Auto Workers decides to expand the scope of their strike, and then all bets are off.
It's a potential impact to the supply of parts, which could end up driving up costs. Richard Zussman, Global News.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced several measures this week to address the cost of living crisis in Canada at the end of his party's caucus retreat. The new measures include several ways to tackle the housing crisis. But the question is, will they actually make a difference? Mercedes Stevenson returns with a new season of The West Block and joins us now to answer that question. Mercedes.
Farah, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced in London that the Liberals are finally following through on a promise they first made in the 2015 election, to remove the GST on the construction of new apartment buildings. We spoke with 2 big city mayors to find out if these measures will make a difference for Canadians looking for a new home. The bottom line, mayors say all 3 levels of government need to work together.
The idea of blaming one level of government or another does not get more units in the ground quicker. What gets more units in the ground quicker is collaborating, talking, designing programs at all levels of government that actually cause us to work together and create the conditions for putting many units in the ground, and not just general units, but the kinds of housing we need.
Calgary's mayor says a strong economy, an influx of international students, and people coming from abroad, including those escaping war zones like Ukraine, means that the housing crisis is only getting worse.
It's really sort of the perfect storm. We started to see people in positions of vulnerability when it came to housing, especially glaringly during COVID. And since then, we've been taking in a lot more people, over 60 individuals a day, if you break down the math, and we just can't keep pace.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre blames the housing crisis on Trudeau and says he will introduce his own plan to get homes built when Parliament reconvenes on Monday. Farah?
Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa. Thank you, Mercedes. And you can watch the full interviews tomorrow on the season premiere of The West Block right here on Global. Navigating landmines on the front lines. Ahead, how Moscow's mines are impacting Ukraine's counteroffensive. In Ukraine, the country's government says one of the biggest factors affecting the speed of its counteroffensive is the density of landmines across its enormous front line. By some estimates, it's going to take years or even decades to completely remove all the landmines in the country. In the meantime, Ukrainians are getting creative in those efforts. Redmond Shannon reports.
A painstaking and deadly job. The sappers who clear mines in Ukraine are nicknamed hedgehogs by their comrades. Sometimes wearing these Canadian-designed spider boots for protection. Ukraine has laid its own mines too, but the majority are Russian. Moscow's mines are defending hundreds of kilometres of front line. In some places, they are up to 16 kilometres deep. By some estimates across Ukraine, an area twice the size of the Maritimes is now contaminated by mines. Even after the counteroffensive and the war is over, it will likely take years or even decades to clear all the mines. President Volodymyr Zelensky has appealed to allies for more expertise and equipment. In the meantime, some Ukrainians have taken matters into their own hands, like engineer Vitaly.
When these chains rotate, they can hit the ground with a force of 1 ton, detonating any mine.
He has designed a mine flail machine from a regular excavator and is now testing it with the army.
We calculated that it destroys 100% of mines.
But if that doesn't prove to be the case, this huge machine can be controlled remotely to check how its tracks hold up driving over large mines. Machines like this would be sitting ducks on the front line, so would only be used on recaptured land. Meaning the work of fearless sappers will be crucial to any advances Ukraine makes on the battlefield. Day after day, inch by inch, many of them have died and will die, sacrificing their own future for that of Ukraine. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Next, Woman, Life, Freedom. The global movement that still rages on 1 year after the death of Mahsa Amini.
We begin with a pair of deadly mysteries.
What's going on? This is insane.
We really believe that it was likely that this was a kidnapping.
Once the case goes cold, it just goes in a box.
I wanted to end my life.
That caused the hairs on my arms to stand.
I saw my dad just like hanging and bleeding hard.
And I heard pop, pop, pop. And I said, Father God, my kids have been shot.
What was the motive?
Hate. She never had a chance.
Watch Crime Beat every Friday and Sunday night all summer on Global. The newscast that's more than just the news of the day.
Access to Lahaina by ground has been largely limited to emergency operations.
Covering and uncovering stories that matter.
This is a war that's still being fought, and they're adding photographs of fallen soldiers.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
In the end, it was the new buildings that crumbled. The old buildings are still standing.
Winner of the 2023 Canadian Screen Award for Best National News Anchor and Best National Newscast.
In Iran today, security forces have released Mahsa Amini's father after briefly detaining him and warning him not to mark the anniversary of his daughter's death. Amini's death in police custody 1 year ago unleashed months of anti-government protests that spiraled into the biggest show of opposition to the authorities in years. 1 year later, Mahsa Amini's legacy is still being felt in Iran and around the world. Nagar Moshtahedi reports.
The chants that defined Iran after the death of Mahsa Jina Amini. Woman, life, freedom. Canadians joining those around the world today, showing their support for the people of Iran in their fight against the regime. Demonstrators say they're here to amplify calls for freedom and justice.
They lived in fear, even from far, because all of us, we have our families stay in Iran, but now we're gathering to make things happen.
Mashallah. What started out as grief and anger over Mahsa Amini's death quickly turned into a rallying cry that echoed through some of Iran's biggest protests in decades. The 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman died while under the detention of the country's so-called morality police last year after being accused of not wearing her hijab properly. Demonstrators say Amini has turned into a symbol, with demonstrations evolving over the past 12 months, saying now it's about everyone and everything in Iran.
Because of this solidarity of the whole globe behind us, that's why we can do it. That's why this time is completely different.
Many Iranian women, in an act of defiance, are refusing to wear the compulsory hijab, no matter what the consequences. Videos surfacing online show a much different country than before Amini's death. This woman reportedly fighting back after a cab driver demanded she cover her hair. Since the nationwide uprising started last year, the atrocities in Iran are mounting. 5 protesters linked to the movement have been hanged, more than 500 demonstrators killed, dozens of them children. And hundreds of schoolgirls choking, coughing, falling ill after apparent chemical attacks. Demonstrators in Vancouver say the fight is not over, and they will keep up with weekly Saturday rallies to support Iranians who they say just want to have a normal life. Negar Moshehedi, Global News.
And that's Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Farah Nasser. On behalf of our whole crew, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us tonight. Tonight's Your Canada is the Masa Jina Amini street sign in Ottawa, paying tribute to the 22-year-old. The city installed this sign in June in front of the former site of the Iranian embassy. It's going to stay there for a year, then it'll be moved to City Hall. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.